Hi everyone, we are in week 12 now, so we are going to be finishing up with chapter 6 and going into chapter 7. I have tried to find a quiet place to talk with you. If you hear any background noise, I've got a husband working from home, I've got the foster dog here, and for some reason the birds outside are really excited and very active and chirpy. So if you hear any noises, pardon me. Hopefully nothing will interfere too much. So I want to go ahead and get us up and running. You will need your textbooks for what we're going to be doing, or I'll be referencing specific pages. So if you want to pause me for a moment and go get your textbook, of course, please feel free to do that. That way you can go along with what I'm discussing, okay? And of course, you can pause this video at any time. I know these are not the shortest lectures in the world, but there's always a lot to cover. I want to make sure that you're clear on everything, that you're not having any worries about missing that clarity that comes from in class. So if you need to pause, if you need to stop, if you need to resume at any time, I am very well aware that a little of anybody goes a long way, and that will definitely not hurt my feelings. But I do miss having these discussions with you guys, so I am hoping that this is at least some sort of substitute. But if I had my preference, of course, we would be chatting about all of this together. So I hope all of you are doing well. And of course, keep reaching out if you need anything. I've been really happy to hear from a lot of you. So let's start with, of course, you'll see on my screen right now, it says chapter 7, but we're going to kind of tail end chapter 6. And with chapter 7, please don't be alarmed by the way my screen looks. I definitely know how to operate PowerPoint, so please don't worry about my faculties. But I found that with this screen capture software, sometimes if I hold my nose the wrong way or look at something the wrong way, things tend to flip around, so I'm being very cautious. So if things look a little funky, my apologies. It's just the fun that is screen capture software. So chapter 7, I'm holding this up on the screen, but I'm going to actually be talking about finalizing chapter 6, okay? So through this discussion or through this lecture, you're going to hear me finalize chapter 6, then we'll go into chapter 7. We'll do some activities with that, and then I'll be talking about piece by piece all of the assignments due. So you'll get a full sense of what's going on, okay? So just as a heads up, by the end of this video, you'll have heard about 3 classwork assignments, and I'll announce those very clearly through the video. Classwork assignment number 1, number 2, number 3. Also, the big thing that's due at the end of this week, and that is going to be on Friday, April 3rd. So the deadline for everything, for classwork grades 1, 2, and 3, all together in one file, and your paper, the position argument essay, all of those are due Friday, April 3rd, 11:59 p.m. And if you would like for me to look at a rough draft of your paper, just let me know. I'll be glad to take that. You can send it to me through the end of the day, 11:59 p.m. on Thursday the 2nd, and I can give you some comments. And if you have any concerns with the paper, let me know. Please feel free to keep in touch. Text me, call me, email me, any of those types of things. So that way we know what's going on. Under week 12, there's a Dropbox for your homework and a Dropbox for your paper. Make sure you put your files in the appropriate spot, and I'll remind you of these things as we're closing out today. So let's start with our end of chapter 6. I'm closing chapter 6 actually with an essay from the book, and this essay is titled, "Are Millennials the Screwed Generation?" And this is on page 244 of your textbook. And with this essay, I picked it because this is a common topic of conversation, that there's something inherently wrong with millennials. And I am one of those, so maybe I just have a personal investment in the topic. Millennials now, it's kind of agreed upon, are going to be people in their 20s to late 30s. Technically, all of these people out there who are saying, oh, millennials do this, millennials do that, are probably mixing up millennials and Generation Z. But the millennials that are out here now are all late 20s to late 30s. So that's the generation that we're talking about here. So with this essay that Joel Kotkin has, he's talking about all these reasons that he thinks that millennials have a very tough road ahead of them. And he feels like there are particular groups to blame. I picked this essay because if you're thinking about how your position paper is going to be structured, it's all rebuttal. This is great practice. I know you did that last week, of course. You did have a rebuttal practice. I just wanted to reinforce that with Kotkin's essay and have you do one last rebuttal thing to kind of get chapter 6 out. So let's say that first. This is classwork assignment number 1. Pick one point from Joel Kotkin's essay, Are Millennials the Screwed Generation, on page 244 in your textbook, and give a 3 to 4 sentence rebuttal of any one of those points in there. So take a point, talk about why in 3 to 4 sentences this point is illogical, impractical, not filled out enough, doesn't consider particular things. Let me give you an example. So I'm on page 247 and the paragraph number that I'm in is 11. Okay. So he's built up to this point by talking about all of these bad things that he argues that baby boomers have gifted to the millennial generation. All of these bad economic elements, the high cost of things, low job prospects, things of that nature. In paragraph 11, he mentions there's the debt that millennials have incurred themselves. The average student already carries $12,700 in credit card and other kinds of debt. Okay? So this is a point, he's not really saying anything about the debt, he's just saying that it exists. You can, with your rebuttal points, not just say this is why your point is wrong, but this is what you have missed. So if I'm looking at paragraph 11, I'm thinking, okay, well, so what? Yes, that is a lot of debt. That's a problem. High credit card debt is something that can, torment people for a long time because they have to, of course, pay it back. But I guess I'm not understanding where this fits into the bigger scope of his argument. So I might say for my rebuttal of his point, I would start with, in paragraph 11, Joel Kotkin mentions that that millennials have a high level of debt, exceeding $10,000 in credit card debt. And I might go along with this. Yes, we can definitely see where this number is a problem, and this number would have lifelong effects on people. However, this number and this issue is not explained enough. For example, is he arguing that it's the baby boomers' fault that people are in debt? Is he arguing that this is a matter of personal responsibility that millennials are in debt? How did this come to be? And why do we need to know this in the context of the argument? He is missing several points to go along with this credit card debt discussion that would be helpful to understand how this is going to be bad for millennials in the future. Okay, so that's your classwork assignment number 1. Take one point from Joel Kotkin's essay on page 244 and give a rebuttal of it. That may mean that you talk about this point doesn't hold up to logic, this point is unethical, this point doesn't make great connections, this point misses something. So whatever you see is the case there. So 3 to 4 sentences rebutting one point from Joel Kotkin's essay. Okay? So that's your first classwork assignment knocked out. Of course, if you go to week 12 and you see that we have the 2 drop boxes, it'll say Kotkin Chapter 7 and McCormick assignments. Make sure that you upload all of your classwork to that in one file. And then, of course, below that is the position argument essay. And I talked a lot about that last week, so I would say it's a great idea to go back to those notes, to go back to those samples, and just to keep in touch with any questions that you have. I am more than glad to help you in any way. And I would say those samples are particularly strong because they just really execute that rebuttal structure perfectly. So if you are looking for all the information on that essay, I would definitely say go to week 11 in your modules, and you will find all of those resources you need for the position argument essay. Okay, so we have classwork grade number 1. We have talked about, again, the fact that the position argument essay is due Friday, April 3rd, 11:59 p.m. Now let's talk about Chapter 7. This is the chapter, I sent you the message, of course, that said this is the chapter I'm saddest about missing talking about with you. This week we're going to get the basics of chapter 7. And next week we're going to do some really fun things talking about words that hopefully you're very familiar with, such as slang. But right now we're going to get kind of the strategies down and talk about what chapter 7 is doing, because that is going to be the basis for your very last paper in this class, which is due Friday, April 24th. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but we'll really address that paper next week. Because I don't want you to be worried about this paper and all of these things swarming around. I want to keep everything sort of in its particular place. Okay, so let's talk about Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is called Change the Terms. Basically, this idea that language is this ever-flowing, ever-changing thing, and the words that we used 10 years ago or 20 or 30 or 40 years ago may not work anymore. Maybe they just feel out of style. Maybe they're inaccurate. Maybe they're even offensive. And so we need to look at the words that we use now and think, is that something that we need to change or that we need to replace? So we're going to go through and talk about these strategies of Chapter 7 together, because your last essay for the class is called a proposal argument. And in that proposal argument, I'm going to have you discuss a word or phrase that you feel like does not work any longer for a number of reasons. And it can't be something that's blatantly offensive that everyone agrees about as a problem, because you don't have an argument. If everybody agrees with you, there is no argument. It will need to be a word or a phrase that you feel like if people looked at it closely enough, they would see there's an issue with it, and you would offer options for change. It's a great paper to work with, but it requires some really close reading. So we're going to talk about how to work with these strategies and go from there with Chapter 7, okay? So let's start with our first kind of chunk of things with Chapter 7 that we need to talk about. And again, pardon any thumbs with my PowerPoint. For some reason, it seems like I'm, having a little bit of a struggle, but, it is what it is. Bear with it. So with Chapter 7, this is the opening section in your textbook. If you're looking at this chapter, I've kind of summed up the main takeaways that justify why we have this chapter. So I did mention, of course, that language is always changing. So new terms and phrases come up, others fall out of fashion. I think about sort of silly things like when I was growing up, a really popular slang term was cool beans. It still sounds ridiculous. Like if, someone said, oh my gosh, do you want to go to the skating rink with me later? Yeah, cool beans. And you think about, in hindsight, boy, that sounds really silly, but at the time, that was the height of amazingness to say cool beans, and, you'd see each other at the skating rink. And things fall out of fashion because after a while, someone's like, oh, that is not, it's not how we want to say that. That seems silly. It just doesn't work anymore. We're going to focus a little bit more on academic type terms with this chapter, but I still encourage you to think about words in general with these strategies, because I feel like with our language ever changing, we can look at words from all kinds of categories, academic or not, and see why they fit and why they don't after a certain amount of time. Okay? So the chapter is focusing heavily on academic terms and talks about why they may get tossed out of favor. So one reason might be that the term suggests an old prejudice. And not prejudice in that sort of very narrow, limited way that the term is actually, racist or sexist or against a certain group of people, but maybe that the academic term is something that has this kind of implied bias that's present there, that when you start looking at it closely, you're like, ooh, that might mean something very different to this person than the other person, and that could potentially read as offensive. And I know that people do say these days, like, oh, it seems like you can't use any particular words that's going to offend somebody. It's really not thinking along those lines that, that anything can be offensive. It is, let's look carefully at the words that we use, and if we can change the conversation just a little bit so we don't hurt someone's feelings, what's the harm? Not meaning that we have to change every word we've ever used in the history of the world, so we're not going to extremes here. We are just being very nuanced, okay? So a term might get kicked out because it suggests an old prejudice. I think about terms that we used to talk about mental health in the past. Now these are considered very limiting. I think about the ways that we've talked about disease in the past, where it focuses more on the disease than the person. So these are all these little ways that old terms get shoved out because they just might make it feel like that there's a certain bias against a group of people. Okay, even if you don't intend it that way, if you use a certain word about mental health, even if you are not coming from some bad place, the word you're using might imply that. Okay, so that's reason number one that a term might get kicked out and stopped being used. Another reason why we may stop using a particular term is that it ignores complexity. Okay, and it may be that the term just oversimplifies something and it doesn't look at the depth that goes along with the concept that it represents. So we'll talk about a few terms and what their connotations are. What's the cloud of meaning that goes along with that? And does that word speak to that level of complex meaning? Okay. So far, a term might get kicked out or might not be used anymore because there is some bias that feels like it's present there. And that's not the way that we approach things anymore. A term may not be showing the complexity of the concept that it stands for. Another reason why a term might get kicked out is that it suggests something different from the normal concept. That when you look at the term a little bit closely, it's not that it represents a bias or a prejudice or something like that, but it's like, oh, when you look at this word, I'm not sure if that holds up. And your textbook talks about the phrase war on drugs. Okay, so the war on drugs is intended to keep people, of course, from manufacturing, selling, and using drugs. But the textbook talks about if you use the word war, it makes it sound like this is weaponized. It makes it sound like there's this very particular enemy that we're fighting against. And the war on drugs doesn't necessarily look just like a war. The war on drugs is more of this trying to tackle a really complicated problem at several different sources, but it's not necessarily in the way that we do things when we have warfare. So suggesting something different from the normal concept, the word and the concept just might not quite fit. Okay. A term also might get kicked out because it's gathered negative connotations. That over time, people say, "Oh, okay, so initially this had, really good intentions. Now, not so much." And I think about just a really simple standard thing. So, before the 1980s, if you wanted to talk about all human beings, you used mankind, he, him. That was just standard. I highly doubt anybody going around using mankind was sexist and saying, I hate women, they shouldn't exist. I don't know that they were coming from that place. However, over time, this idea presented itself, starting roughly in the 1980s, that you can't use mankind to cover all humans because that could potentially erase women. So, however you stand on the use of mankind or man or he, or using mailman or fireman instead of mail carrier and firefighter, it's just culturally over time, in a general sense, using man to cover all humans has held some negative connotations, and that's why it changed. Okay, so those are 4 reasons why academic terms, or sometimes terms in general, just stop being used. There's a number of problems, and it can be multiple problems, or it can be one single one. Okay, so let's talk about strategies here for changing the terms. So the first strategy that we'll talk about is detect and describe inaccuracy. If you're going to say that there's a problem with a term, you need to be able to address clearly what that problem is. Okay? And so if you are looking at a word and you can say, okay, well, this is overly simplistic. It doesn't quite cover the complexity of the situation. It could read a little offensive. Just be able to specifically say what exactly is going on there. I'm going to actually take us to a page in chapter 7, and this is page 135, and we're going to talk about this together. So The exercise on the top of page 135 says, consider a common term or phrase related to college courses such as higher education, standardized test, unit, chapter test, midterm review, or knowledge retention. How does the term or phrase miss something critical? Okay. I'm going to go with higher education, the first term in the list. So if I was talking about this, higher education sounds like it is higher than something. And you could say, yes, okay, it goes beyond high school. It's a different level than high school. Higher, though, sometimes can sound like superior, okay? So higher education has been used to talk about college, usually like a four-year college where someone might get a bachelor's, master's, or PhD, okay? And when you say that these types of colleges are higher education, even if you don't intend it, you might be implying that people who don't go for those degrees have lower education. There's something lesser there. And that can read as problematic because it doesn't account for trade schools, associate's degrees, or people for many different reasons who decide college is not for them. So if I'm talking about the problems with the term higher education, I could say it misses a couple of things. It distorts a couple of things. And keep in mind what's going on with page 135. We're going to be going back to that soon. So strategy 1, detect and describe inaccuracy. Now let's go to strategy 2, detect and describe the quiet associations. We've talked about quiet associations before. When you're looking at a term, when you're looking at a concept, when you're looking at a behavior, there's these sort of underlying meanings there that people don't necessarily talk about openly, but we all feel them. So these are the attitudes, beliefs, and feelings that linger around a certain word. So if you're going to start with, okay, there's something kind of off about this word, it doesn't quite work, make sure you can also talk about how the word is part of this broader cultural element. People feel a certain way about it. People have a certain attitude about it. People believe certain things about it. Okay? That's going to take me to page 139. And this is the exercise that we're going to talk about together as well. So keep in mind, hold that thought for a moment too. With these pages I've talked about, 135, 139, we're going to go back to both of those cumulatively shortly. So 139, the top of the page says, as a class or group, examine another term and consider its quiet associations, the automatic ideas that come with the term itself. Consider, for instance, one of the following: ethnic, third world, mature, punk, book smart, hot. Okay. List the associations that come to mind. Also discuss how the situation or context might affect the associations of the term. I'm going to go with book smart. And of course, there's a lot of things you could say about any of these terms, so I'm just going to broach a little bit. So associations with book smart. I do think about someone who's highly intelligent, who would test well, who may not have to study as much as another person, who always has the answers in class. But then I think about other associations. Book smart, a lot of times there's cultural feelings that this person does not have common sense, that this person can solve an equation but couldn't change a tire, that this person might be so engrossed in thought they wouldn't check both ways before crossing the street. And with book smart too, you might argue that there's an association of limited knowledge. This person is great academically but maybe weak other places. And these have just been persistent cultural feelings about the term book smart. And as far as how the context might affect the associations of the term, book smart would feel very positive when someone's in a classroom. It might not feel so positive if this person was on like Survivor, for example, and needing to start a fire. Okay, so we've looked at a couple strategies so far. First one, if you're trying to change the terms, detect and describe inaccuracy. We looked at page 135. And then strategy 2, detect and describe the quiet associations. So we talked about pages 135, 139. This is going to be the basis for classwork assignment number 2. So classwork assignment number 1, as you remember, was to give a 3 to 4 sentence rebuttal of one of the points in Joel Kotkin's essay. Classwork assignment 2 is to answer the exercise on page 135 with any one of those terms in the list, including the one I used, if you can say something different about it, and to answer page 139 exercise. I would say don't work with the term third world because we're going to talk about that in another context later, but any of the other terms you're welcome to work with. So just to reiterate, classwork assignment number 2, that should be pages 135 and 139. Answer those questions, and I would say you could probably do 2 to 3 sentences for each for a total of 4 to 6 sentences. So the Kotkin thing, the Kotkin classwork assignment number 1 was 3 to 4 sentences. Classwork assignment 2, answer pages 135 and 139 exercises in a total of 4 to 6 sentences. So far, you've got a small number of sentences to work with, and I'll kind of reiterate these at the end as well. And of course, if you're ever thinking, okay, I have some questions, let me know. I'll be glad to help. Things can be a little fleeting when it comes to voice delivery of instruction as opposed to written things and things of that nature. So we are going to talk about the rest of the strategies today, but we're not going to put those fully into practice until next week. So we're going to be talking about all of the rest of these Chapter 7 strategies. I'm going to give you a little bit of practice in pulling these all together, but we're going to really deal with strategies 3, 4, and 5 more in depth next week. And pardon me if I ever get a little tongue twisted and tied. I figure going back and editing the videos may not be worth it, and of course we're all human and imperfect, and we're going to make some mistakes. So pardon mine, I'll pardon yours, and we're all good. So let's talk about our third strategy here. Propose a different term. So if you're going to say that something is wrong with the term, the idea should come forth that, well, what do we do about it? What's the different thing that we do? So if you're going to say, okay, well, this term is a problem. There's some issues with the quiet associations. So here's the new way that we should look at this term, or here's the new term that we should put forth. That doesn't mean that you have to make up a new word. Shakespeare was a big fan of doing that. You don't have to be Shakespeare unless you would really want to be. But think about what would be a word that would be more helpful, that would be more accurate, that would be less offensive, and would still cover the same concept. Strategy 4, this is more about playing with the terms. I would say if you're talking about changing the terms, 1, 2, and 3 are going to be the basis of your last paper for this class, which I'll talk about momentarily. So strategies 1, 2, and 3, you definitely need to know. What's the problems with this existing term? What are the problematic quiet associations? What's the new term? There you go. If you want to sort of have a few more intellectual games with your terms, then strategies 4 and 5 will help you make sure you've addressed all of the issues with the terminology, that you've covered 1 and 2 really well. So let's look at strategy 4, flip the terms. If you're thinking, okay, this term feels kind of problematic, but I can't quite put my finger on what exactly is wrong, then think about the term in terms of its opposite, okay? So let's say that you were looking at the term create, okay? You might say, okay, well, what's its opposite? Destroy, okay? Or tear down. And you say, okay, well, let me think about create in terms of destroy. What does that tell me about create if I'm defining destroy? So destroy, of course, is to tear down, is to pull apart, is to ruin, is to eliminate. But to create is to build up, to put into being, to make. Okay? So if we say, okay, well, let's look at create in terms of destroy, well, maybe the insight that we can get from that is that maybe creation has to use destruction as a basis, that they are actually really interconnected. When you destroy, you don't completely get rid of things. When you create, you might be pulling from destruction or be inspired by destruction to put something together. And this is just me spitballing ideas. You don't have to come up with these beautiful answers that say, oh, now that I've looked at this term with its opposite, I know it all, I am great. You don't have to have those be-all, end-all, definitive, I've got all the responses here. Just think about the opposites and see how those work for you. And we're going to do some exercises next week that play with opposites a little bit more and see what you make of those. Okay? So strategies 1, 2, 3, and 4. 1, 2, and 3 being the most important as far as your later papers are concerned, and maybe as far as your exam is concerned. I would say strategy 4 slips in there occasionally. Now our fifth and final strategy in Chapter 7, change the lens. I love this strategy with looking at terms because changing the lens means that you look at your word from a different perspective. Okay? So if you're a man, you think about the term if you were a woman. If you are a Christian, look at the term as you think an atheist might. If you are, 19 years old, how do you think a 59-year-old would look at the term? And this is just a way of saying, okay, if I feel like this term might be problematic, or if I feel like this term might actually be good, what happens when I look at it from the perspective of someone else? Does that change at all? Does that change how the perception of the term might be for that person? So using that lens, I think it's a good way to generate empathy. Put yourself in someone's shoes for a moment. Does this word actually hold up if I'm looking at it from a totally different perspective? We're going to be doing a lot of that next week, and I'm looking forward to it because I'm going to be asking you to change the lens in multiple ways, and we're going to be looking at a variety of interesting words, to say the least. So we've got our 5 strategies here for Chapter 7. So far, I've given you 2 classwork assignments, one of which is the rebuttal to one of Kotkin's points in Our Millennials the Screwed Generation on page 244 in your textbook. The second, and let me backtrack, and that response should be 3 to 4 sentences. The second classwork assignment is to complete the exercises on pages 135 and 139 with 2 to 3 sentences each for a total of 4 to 6 sentences. Now that's going to bring me to our third and final classwork assignment. So if you will turn with me to the essay titled The Third World. That's on page 258 of your textbook, and the author John McCormack is doing a phenomenal job of talking about where this word or this phrase, the third world, started, where the problems with this term might be, and what we can do about it. Okay? So what I'm asking you to do is kind of a scaled down version of Chapter 7 applied to this essay. So what I'm asking you to do is, in maybe a sentence or 2 each, apply strategy 1, strategy 2, strategy 3, strategy 4, and strategy 5 to the third world. You can do this in one of 2 ways. You can talk about how McCormack does this strategy, or you can do the strategy on your own, okay? So strategies 1 through 5 of Chapter 7, apply that to the third world and talk about either how McCormack achieves that strategy or how you apply that strategy. Either way works for me. Okay? So you've got your 3 classwork assignments. The one that goes with McCormack and his, Kotkin. See, this is the fun of not editing video. Let me back up there, walk that back a moment. So you've got your 3 classwork assignments. The first one is the rebuttal to one of Kotkin's points. The second is pages 135 and 139 exercises. And the third is to apply all 5 Chapter 7 strategies to the essay on page 258 titled The Third World. Okay? So all of those 3 things together, those 3 classwork assignments, 1 file, upload that to the Dropbox under week 12 titled Kotkin Chapter 7 McCormack Assignments, and you're good to go. I did want to do a brief mention before we close about the essay that you've got due this week, and then, of course, a future essay, but I'm not going to try to put too much in there and be completely overwhelming. So outside of the 3 classwork assignments that you have Friday, April 3rd, 11:59 p.m., you do have your position argument essay due. Please make sure and double check over your guideline sheet, over the samples, over the topics. With the topics that you potentially have, of course, the main thing is making sure that there are clear views on this topic, that it's not settled, that there's a lot of opposing views out there. And if you're getting stuck as you're working on your paper, there's still time to talk to me. There's still time to send me drafts. So Thursday, April 2nd, by the end of the day, you can email me a rough draft. I will be more than glad to help you out, and I'm devoting as much time as I possibly can to helping you with these papers. You just have to reach out and let me know how I can assist. Do make sure that your assignments are accounted for. Remember, you do get 3 attendance credits per week, and you get 300 points per week for your assignments. So if you're ever worried that something is not going in the Dropbox, you just want to make sure you're absolutely on the safe side, email me backups. You are more than welcome to do that, or just text, call, email me if you're feeling a little worried about anything in general. This distance doesn't allow me to address as much as I would love to because I can't see your faces, but I am here to help no matter what. So I hope everybody is very much aware of that. I always like to talk to you so you can get in touch with me anytime. So we've done the tail end of Chapter 6 with rebuttal. We've talked about Chapter 7. I've given you the classwork assignments on Kotkin, Chapter 7, and McCormick. And I want to close by talking about very briefly your last essay for the class, just so you can kind of keep this in mind. This essay is not due until the very last class day, which is April 24th, a Friday. And of course, after that, we have our exams. So April 24th, Friday, 11:59 p.m., the last argument essay you have is the proposal argument. A proposal argument is all about addressing a problem and finding viable solutions. And you're going to be doing that with a word. So you will be talking about how a particular word or phrase is problematic, not something that everybody agrees on, because then again, as mentioned, you don't have an argument, but how it would be a problem for enough people that it's not you just saying it's a problem, basically. So first off, you will discuss what the problem is with this word or phrase. Then you will offer solutions to the problem. And that may mean people need to act in a particular way. There's a new word that we can use, anything along those lines. So the word that you use can be virtually anything, as long as this is a loaded kind of word. It's connotative. There's a lot of quiet associations there. The typical 3.5 to 4 pages is needed here, 3 sources, and I would say the dictionary is going to be your best friend. You need to have clear definitions of your term, of your word or phrase. So I would say a lot of your source material is going to be dictionary. And I've got the outline for what the intro, main points, and conclusion should have. So basically your intro would need to give background on that term, give your thesis. Your main points will need to discuss what is the problem associated with that term, what's wrong with it. So what does it miss? What does it overlook? Where might it be offensive? Where might it be too simplistic? How long has this been a problem? If this term stays, what ongoing problems might be the case? So make sure that we feel like, oh, this really is a problem with this word. It's not just, it's a little problematic. We can live with that. No, this is an issue that's going to get worse, perhaps. And then after you discuss your problem, give at least 2 potential solutions to the problem. Exact solutions. What is the exact word you would replace this with, or what are the exact behaviors you would recommend if people are still going to use this word or phrase? Things of that nature. And you need to talk about specific pros and cons. That's kind of proposal 101. What's your problem? What's your solutions? And what are the pros and cons of those solutions. The conclusion should talk about which of the solutions is best and why, and you can tie back to the importance of the problem if you like. So this is my very initial overview of this final paper. I'm going to give you a lot more details next week, but if you do want to look ahead, if you feel like you just kind of want to get a sense of what's going on with this, under week 13 in Canvas, you will see sample essays, possible topics list, and you'll see these guidelines. So all of that material is there for you, and that way you can kind of look through them. But just remember for this week, Friday, April 3rd, make sure to send in your 3 classwork assignments into the Dropbox. Also include the final draft of your position argument essay and send me rough drafts up through Thursday, April 2nd by 11:59 p.m. so that I can help you and get you some answers back by Friday. So Friday, April 3rd, 3 classwork things. You've got the paper. Let me know how I can help. I hope you all have a good week. Stay safe, stay healthy, and try to enjoy some of this beautiful springtime weather. Talk to you soon. Bye.